Hello again everyone. Video 5 in this series already. My name is still Jochen, and if you've stuck with me throughout this whole series of videos so far, then you know what I do in the safari and ecotourism business. But if you're new to this series and you don't know, please see video number 1 in this series for a complete introduction. In fact, I strongly suggest watching all the videos in the correct order before watching this one. We've come to the most important video in this series now. This is the video where I come to conclusions with regards to how to get the most out of your safari in Kruger. And in order to understand what I'm talking about and to understand why I come to these conclusions, you certainly need to have digested all the info I gave you in the previous videos. Because in those videos I focus on the Kruger National Park, that's video number 2, and I focus on private reserves in video number 3, and on all other regions that can be combined with Kruger in video number 4. And now in this video it all comes together, so to speak. Alright, a quick word on how we are going to proceed in this video. I'll start with a wide view, so covering all regions of South Africa that you would want in your itinerary, and then I'll work my way down to the safari part. Now, since this video is actually in essence about Kruger, obviously I'm going to focus a lot on your safari days. But we'll start with a little bit of a wider view. So you may combine your safari part in Kruger with some other regions in South Africa or even just in our neighboring countries. But the most important thing is that you do not forget that the safari part is the essential part. All the rest is pretty much a bonus. It is wildlife that makes South Africa special, not the cities, not the mountains, and not the beaches, etc. They're nice, but other countries have them too. As such, your wildlife days should cover on average 50% of your total days spent in South Africa. Average, so if you stay shorter than 2 weeks, that percentage should maybe a little bit higher. If you stay longer than 2 weeks, you can go slightly lower. Here's a bit of advice I have for you. Lots of safari proposals you see online that look like an absolute steal fail to meet this 50% requirement. Now, since wildlife days, so your real safari days spent in the bush, are the most expensive days on any itinerary, lots of agents try to minimize the number of such days, so that they can lower their itinerary prices overall, and by doing so, lure more customers to book with them. Please do not fall for this trick. Now, you may say, but I don't know if I'm going to like safari activity, so maybe I should rather stick to 1 or 2 days of safari and for the remainder of my trip do other things. Or you might say, but I'm not sure my kids will love it. They'd perhaps rather be at the beach. Yeah, there's plenty of reasons why for yourself you might try to justify an itinerary with like only a limited amount of days spent around wildlife. But let me tell you now, you will love your safari days and your kids will love it too. Just to give you a couple of examples, I have had people in a lodge that my wife and I managed, and they won a prize. So they went to a fundraising dinner, and they were one of the biggest. They gave one of the biggest donations, I guess, and because of that, they won a safari. And these people were not even expecting to go on safari. They never thought about it. They didn't know it was going to be for them. But now, since they won the trip, obviously they want to do it. So they came to us, and them as well, they absolutely loved it. So if you are someone who's been thinking about going on safari for a long time and are now making specific plans to do so, then you definitely will love your safari days. Let me tell you the example I just gave you about these people that came from that fundraising dinner. It wasn't just one family, hey? Like this lodge had a deal with an auctioneer in the States. So we had plenty of people like that who always wanted the same type of safari trip and who came to us, and they all raved about their safari days. The same goes with customers with kids. You might think, oh, is my kid gonna behave on the vehicle and be able to sit still and blah blah blah. To be honest, as long as you give them a lodge with a swimming pool or something like that, something they can get rid of their energy with over noon, then it's absolutely no problem. Once they get on the vehicle, they will grab those binos, they will try to spot animals, and they will love it from the very first till the very last minute. So I honestly wouldn't worry about that, and I would really advise you to stick to that 50% rule. Even if you're visually impaired or hearing impaired, I'd say stick to the 50% rule. Yes, those safari days are for you too. I have had all types of people on my vehicle. I have had visually impaired people who could hear things much better than I did, and they had lots of fun pinpointing lions by their roars and then later by some soft purrs when they were calling their cubs. With them I found animals that we would otherwise not have found at all. I have had people on my vehicle who brought along an interpreter to translate all I say into sign language. And they were ecstatic when they felt the infrasonic grumbles of of elephants talking to each other, for example. It's something that regular people do not pick up on. I even had a family with a very autistic child that was sitting in between them in the middle seat, listening to a little cube, a plastic cube, a radio with traditional songs from their country, nodding its head up and down. And they told me at the beginning of the drive, do not look at our kid too much. She won't get much out of it. Just focus on us to teach us something about the bush, but it's no use trying to talk to the kid. Well, how wrong they were. Yeah, I've put that little child on. I must say I pushed the limits here a bit, but I've put that little child on the lap of my tracker on the bonnet, and we drove close to elephants. And for the first time in a long time, that kid snapped out of its state or whatever you want to call that, and was looking with big eyes at the elephants first, but then later interacting with a small elephant that came to greet it like a kid, like a little baby elephant. I can assure you, it was a bit of a life-changing moment for all of us. So something like that might happen with you as well. So there's something to be had for everyone. Your safari days are fun for everyone. So basically, I guess what I'm saying is that my point is that everybody gets something out of it. So please stick to that 50% rule. Now, if you stick to that 50% rule, that means automatically that if you only come for a short period to South Africa, that you've got some tough choices to make. Because, for example, if you only have a week to spend, 50% is 4 days of safari. Then that leaves only like 3 or 4 days to do something else. And you might say, no, I don't want that. I'm going to stick to 2 days in the bush and I'll add more other stuff. Now, just a few other things that I should point out before you let go of that 50% rule, even for short itineraries. First, a very important remark: wildlife does not come on demand. So if you come to Kruger and you're opting for a safari in the Greater Kruger Area, so I mean the proper thing, not a fenced zoo-like reserve that can show you the big five easily, then you'll need multiple days, like 3 or 4 days preferably, to have a fair chance of seeing all of the big five. Some iconic species in particular, like rhino, lion and leopard, do not show themselves every day. End the story. Now I know you could say, oh, hold on, but if I choose an expensive lodge in the most expensive private reserve like Sabi Sand, and I choose a lodge there that has a huge traverse and shares with a lot of other vehicles from other lodges, or it has a huge traverse but it doesn't share with other lodges but it's got lots of vehicles out, then I should have a big chance, even if I just stayed there for 2 days, I should have a very big chance of seeing all there is to see and at least then I'll only have lost 2 days, so to speak, of my total holiday, and I could easily spend the other days on some other things to see and do in South Africa. Well, you have a point, but I'd argue you are still taking chances because you haven't taken one aspect into consideration, which is the weather. The low veld regularly gets cold fronts moving through. These are periods that last 2 to 3 days, sometimes even a bit longer, with heavy winds and often grey skies, but not often rain. These cold fronts pass by in all seasons, and you don't know when the next one will arrive. Well, us guides can sometimes see it the day before by the type of clouds. But the thing with the cold front is, animals don't like it at all. All prey species rely on their sense of smell and their sense of hearing to detect predators in time. Both these senses are useless when there are strong winds, so animals go into hiding. They get into thick bush where they are better protected, both from the elements and from predators. Now, predators tend to be more active during cold fronts, as they now have an advantage. But if they catch something, it's often in that thick bush, and so you won't see any of it. You won't see them. So, if you only come for 3 or 4 days and you hit that cold front, you will basically have a very lousy safari experience. Moreover, far from everyone has the budget to pay for a safari at the most expensive lodges in the most expensive reserve. In fact, one goal of these videos was to show you that you have plenty of other places that offer similar safari results for a better price. Sometimes, though, it just takes a bit more patience. So my advice still stands. If you come to South Africa, please foresee at least 3 to 4 days for a safari. I mean, wouldn't it be a shame to come all this way to have spent so much on international flights and then having to go home without having seen iconic species such as lion? Make no mistake, it happens plenty of times. Just have a look at all the YouTube footage that's around. You'll see plenty of people raving about their safari holidays, and you'd expect that people that rave on YouTube are the people that have seen it all. Because typically, people who haven't seen it all have nothing to rave about. But even all the videos on YouTube, if you really look at them in detail, there's lots of people that have to admit that they only saw what they think was the tail of a leopard, or they admit that they even have to come back because the lions eluded them and stuff like that. So, coming back to, basing your chosen regions and activities on your length of stay, what this means is that if you come for say 10 days and you spend 2 days in transit getting here and flying back, so you got 8 days in the country, an absolute minimum is 3 to 4 days of safari, and then you'll have some tough choices to make when it comes to the rest of your stay. You've got only 4 days left. What should you fill those 4 remaining days with? Cape Town, alright, you can do that. Garden Ride, okay, but then you can't do Cape Town. How about the Panorama Route? Okay, but then you can't do neither the Cape or the Garden Route. How about just some days at the beach? That's cool. Then you do the safari and a beach day, but then you can forget about doing any other route and doing Cape Town. So it's just choices that you will have to make. Please do not make the mistake of trying to pin too much hay on your pitchfork. Itineraries like, 1 day in Joburg, 2 days in the Cape, then 2 days in the Garden Route, followed by 1 day the Panorama Route, and then 1 day on safari, stuff like that. Itineraries like that are absolutely useless. You'll spend more time sitting in airports or watching the landscape glide by from your seat on the bus than anything else. Please don't book itineraries like that. And keep in mind, with a trip that only lasts 8 days or so, when it comes to your safari, you're still taking serious chances. Remember what I said about cold fronts, etc. So 3-4 days is an absolute minimum, and you might still get a little bit unlucky. Preferably, you would need a week or even a bit longer. Okay, so I'll stop my rambling now. Here's some region choices that I would advise based on your length of stay. If you got 8 days to spend, I'd say do the Kruger and the Panorama Route, which is nearby, and leave everything else for a next visit. Just come back to South Africa another time to see the rest. Split those 8 days over 2 lodges, so one that allows for day trips to the panorama route and another lodge in a private reserve. If you come for 12 days, well, then it gets a little bit easier. You can take the itinerary as before, but then just add 4 days in Cape Town. You could also say, nope, I'm going to do the 8-day itinerary of Kruger and panorama route, but in the end I'll stick on 4 days of beach. Also possible. By the way, I know that I combine Kruger and the panorama route a lot. It's just because it's such a very obvious combination. It's one of the most, if not the most scenic routes of South Africa. I've explained this in the 4th video in this series. And it's so easy to combine with Kruger without spending much on travel or transfer costs. So that is why, it's one of my go-to things. Okay, so moving on. Let's say you have 16 days. Well, again, you can take that 8-day Kruger and panorama thing, and then you can do 4 days in the Cape, but now you can add 4 days in the garden route as well. Or you could do 4 days in the Cape, forget about the garden route, come to Kruger for 8 days, and then end with 4 days at the beach. Or you could make sure that you've got absolutely stunning safari results to come home with by making your safari days longer. And so, for example, you could say, no, I'm going to stay 12 days in Kruger and the panorama route. So you could stitch 2 lodges on private reserves together as to see, different things and different vegetation and regions and all that within the Kruger. Add a 3rd lodge to that allows you to go to the panorama route, and then still have 4 days left to do the Cape. Now, obviously, you do the Cape first because that's an easy way to start with your first trip in Africa. Or again, you take the same 12-day Kruger itinerary, and in the end, you add 4 days of beach, so you forget about the Cape at that point. If you stay even longer, and this is now we're coming to the ultimate South Africa trips, I do think that South Africa merits coming 3 weeks. I mean, you're paying for expensive international tickets already, so once you're here, why not enjoy it to the fullest and try to stay 3 weeks? So if you've got like 21 days, then it becomes really easy. Because now you could say, well, okay, I want a very diverse itinerary over 3 weeks, so I am going to do that 8 days of Kruger region, but I am going to also do 4 days at the Cape, 4 days at the garden route, and still end with 4 days at the beach. Perfectly possible. You could also say, well, I'm staying longer in some regions. So you can say, I'm going to stay 6 days in the Cape, still do those 8 days around Kruger, and then stay longer at the beach as well, another 6 days at the beach. Or you could say, well, I stay longer in the Cape and longer in the garden route, and then do the regular 8 days in Kruger, and I don't need beach. Perfectly possible as well. Obviously, from my point of view, if you really want the best safari results and all that, I would try to fit 12 days of Kruger within your 20-day trip. That would mean that, for example, a good itinerary would be you do 4 days in Cape Town, you do 4 days on the garden route, then you come to the Kruger area and you stay here for 12 days. Like I explained, typically 2 lodges inside the private reserve, 1 lodge outside private reserve, from where to go to Kruger National Park and to the panorama route, as to bring a little bit of diversity in your safari days. Perfect itinerary as far as I'm concerned. Another possibility with the same 12 days around Kruger is just to do 4 days in the Cape, then come to Kruger, and then end with 4 days at the beach. So I hope I can conclude this section with my second tip. Choose the right combination of regions depending on your length of stay. This automatically means don't try to squeeze in too many regions. Alright, now let's zoom in on the safari part of your trip. I can imagine you've got questions like, how do I optimize my chances of seeing all animals I want to see? Where do I go to? Do I go to Kruger National Park or do I go to the private reserves? What gives me the best bang for the buck? These are the type of questions I'll try to answer next. And I want to start with diffusing this whole national park versus private reserves discussion. Let's first summarize the positives and negatives of both. So for the national park, as a positive, you could certainly say, the vastness of the park. You can only appreciate the size of the Greater Kruger Area if you drive around in the national park. Another positive is certainly the ability to self-drive and go wherever you want and as long as you want. And another positive is certainly the adventurous aspect. There's something about changing a tire in the bush. There's something about cooking for yourself while there's a honey badger near you or a hyena howling just behind the fence. It's a bit of adventure. Obviously, the national park also has negatives. It can get really crowded and noisy. And I mean in rest camps as well as in very popular sightings. Another negative is certainly the state the accommodation is in. Again, I'm speaking about the rest camps here, not the private lodges on their own private concession within the park borders, so the Kruger National Park rest camps. Most camps are really old and in need of maintenance. They have noisy air cons. Pool pumps break down often and sometimes it takes up to a month to repair. There's worn mattresses and utensils. Sheets have stains. There's bats crapping and peeing all over your bed and dining table. I've read plenty of stories on Facebook groups, and I hear plenty of stories as I'm in the park and from customers that go there and then come to one of the other lodges where I meet them and stuff. So it is getting to be a bigger problem, I'd say, by the year. Another negative is certainly also the quality offered. I mean, even if your bed is clean, it is still a thin mattress. Even if your kitchen is clean, there's still just enough plates for one meal and then you have to start washing your dishes. The rooms are small. There's no privacy. So basically, it's more or less a standard that you'd expect from somewhere in the 80s of last century. Now, at this point, I need to be very clear. Not that I need to defend myself, but I kinda expect the so-called Krugerholics who defend their park no matter what to take offense in some of the things I just said. They'll say, it's not all that bad, there's only issues here and there, and most problems get resolved quickly. But most of them haven't even tried other available accommodation, and so they don't even know the difference with the, between brackets, real world out there. I think though that even the most avid supporters of the park must admit that people are complaining about the standards more often and often. It's very noticeable on Facebook groups like Kruger Best Place on Earth and all that. And some people on those groups may still react by saying, hey, don't complain here, complain to the manager. But the fact is that people want to warn others that Camp X or Y has issues, even if they have complained to a manager. Moreover, the manager on duty should spot potential problems and resolve them even before they become a real big issue. People shouldn't have to complain about standards, let alone on social media. The real problem is actually that there is little quality control, which means that people are not doing their job and or there's simply no budget for keeping the standards up. In other words, the government takes too big of a profit margin from the park for the park to be able to keep standards in line with current expectation levels of customers. By now it's come so far that there's lots of Krugerholics that agree with me. I see Kruger diehards reacting with statements like, when I departed for Kruger in the past, we used to have this awesome feeling of anticipation, but now I must admit, what we feel is uncertainty. Will our accommodation unit be okay? Will I be able to start my safari and do game drives without worry? Or will I rather lose time getting my bungalow the way I want it? And did I bring the needed cleaning products in case I want to clean something myself? Because cleaning myself is obviously faster than waiting for staff to clean things. And if I clean it myself, my accommodation is at least cleaned the way I want it to be, properly. So that's the type of messages I've been seeing a lot these days. So I guess I do have a point when I'm pointing out these negatives for the national park. Okay, moving on. The private reserves. When it comes to positives, there's certainly they can certainly offer a careless vacation. Everything is taken care of. Your meals, your game drives, and it's all included. So that's a positive. Another positive is the very high standard of accommodation and guiding standards. And a third positive, I'd say, is being able to get really close to the animals in absence of the crowds. You can go off-road and there's a maximum of 2 or 3 vehicles around any particular sighting. But obviously, private reserves have negatives as well. Typically, every lodge, even if it has a good traverse, has a small area of operation. I mean, you cannot appreciate the vastness of the Greater Kruger Area by going to a lodge on a private reserve. Another negative is certainly the fixed daily schedule. There is no game viewing over noon, for example. If you really want to maximize your time spent with animals, that is not going to work on a private reserve. You get a morning game drive and an afternoon game drive typically, so you'll spend around 6 to 7 hours in the bush. If you're really a nature enthusiast that is hoping and looking for more, you're not going to get that on a private reserve. And the third negative is obviously having to share your game drive vehicle with others. So if you're used to driving in your own car and being able to throw your photo gear bag anywhere you want, that is certainly a negative. A game drive vehicle might also have people with very different expectations on board. So if one person wants to see nothing but cats, but the other person is an avid birder, the guy behind the steering wheel will have to try to find some middle ground. Of course, this issue is only relevant if you are at a lodge where there's other guests. So if you choose to book a whole lodge exclusively for your whole family or group of friends, then this last one is not an issue for you. Okay, is this comparison that's on your screen complete now? Actually, I can hear some of you shouting all the way up to here, price! There's a huge difference in price! The private reserves are very, very expensive! Well, here's another one of my opinions that Krugerholics will not like. I'd say that's not true. I'd say that if you compare apples with apples, you can easily come to costing figures that are maybe not exactly the same, but very close to one another. And then, for the money you pay, I'd even argue that you may actually get more bang for your buck on the private reserves. Now, before you all go like flying to your keyboard to react to what I just said, I intend to prove with a calculation what I just said. But before I do that, let's make two things very clear. First of all, the calculation I make is for international visitors. South African nationals often start comparing what Kruger National Park costs to them with what a private reserve costs to them. However, from the perspective of an international visitor, such comparison isn't useful at all. Why? Because South African nationals pay only 1/4 of what other people pay as entrance fees to the park. At this moment, it's 100 rands per day for them, and international visitors pay 400 rands a day. But obviously, often the cost difference is even bigger because South African nationals spend so much time in the park on a yearly basis that they can justify the purchase of a wild card. While for an international visitor who only intends to spend 4 to 5 days in the park, such card purchase isn't worth it. He will have to spend more time in the park, or he will have to visit other sand parks before such card becomes useful to him. But quite often it is not his intention to stay longer or to visit other parks. So he'll be paying the full price. Furthermore, as a South African national, he can use his own car to drive in the park, while an international visitor has to deal with the extra cost of having to hire a rental car. And last but not least, the South African national will have everything needed to make his stay as enjoyable and comfortable as he wants, both in camp as well as on game drive. Just a few examples. He will have a tent and sleeping bag somewhere stored in the attic that he can use to go to the park. He will have a cooler box with enough cooling elements for the car. He'll have fleece blankets for the chilly early morning game drives. He will have a portable coffee station, what we call a hot box, with a thermos and all that, to enjoy a coffee break while on morning game drive. The list goes on and on. If you really compare apples with apples, then an international visitor will have to buy all these things, for his experience to be the same. And after his few safari days in the park, all of that equipment that he bought is total loss because he can't take it home. So bottom line, that's my first thing I wanted to make clear. The calculation I'm about to make is only relevant for international visitors. There's a second thing I need to make clear. The calculation I make is for similar accommodation and similar experiences. I often see Krugerholics that want to compare the cost of the cheapest accommodation available in Kruger National Park, which is just a camping spot, with the cost of a room in a posh lodge on, say, Sabi Sand Reserve. I'm sorry, but that is not a correct comparison at all. That is not comparing apples with apples. That's comparing apples with a whole box of mangoes. The truth is that the national park and the private reserves offer different types of accommodation that only partly overlap. The national park covers the lower end of the spectrum better. They've got camping spots and accommodation with shared amenities, for example, while the private reserves cover the higher end of the accommodation spectrum better. They've got suites with outdoor showers and private plunge pools and whatnot. But if you want to compare both correctly, then you must do so by comparing the middle section of the accommodation spectrum, where both overlap. For example, compare a regular rondavel in Kruger National Park, one with all the amenities and a view and such. Compare that with a room in a runner-up camp somewhere in a runner-up reserve, like not the most posh camp, not the most posh reserve. Okay, so now that those 2 points are clear, here's my comparison. For a private reserve, I've taken Timbavati Reserve, which is actually not even the cheapest reserve, I might add. Timbavati is a little bit the runner-up to Sabi Sand. And I chose a lodge on there which is called Shinzela. They've got a 4-night special for about 12,000 rands per person. For Kruger National Park, I took a simple rondavel, like a bungalow, type BD2V, so that means one with a view. Again, for 4 nights, okay, and then you pay 3,650 per person. As you can see, quite a bit of an advantage for the national park so far. Now, okay, we're talking about international visitors, so I assume they'll be flying in to the airport that's nearest to Shinzela and both Olifants, more or less. Hey? Let's say that they fly into Hoedspruit Airport. To be honest, it could be Folaborwa as well, but the price doesn't really make a difference because they'll need a transfer. So the transfer from the airport to Shinzela costs another 1,400 rands per person, and then they're at the Shinzela Lodge. For Kruger National Park, they need to hire a car because they'll be self-driving. Now, I took a car, and obviously I didn't take the smallest car like a Twingo or something to drive in the bush. I don't think that's really, a comparison with the experience then that you would get as a game drive on Shinzela. You do need preferably a car that's a bit higher up on its wheels, like a small SUV, something like that. So I went with the smallest SUV I could find, which is a RAV4. I didn't include any extra insurances, which I could have. And they would make sense because, for example, a tire waiver and a glass waiver is certainly useful while driving in the park. The only thing I did add was a second driver. So at least the people who are going to the park, because, this calculation is for 2 people, that if it's man and woman, they can actually just basically switch, one drives, the other one take pictures and then switch halfway or something. At least they can both enjoy the park without having to drive for a bit. So that's why I added that second driver. Not that it makes much of a difference in the total cost of that rental car. I also did add about 1,000 rands a day for petrol. Don't forget, normally it's 5 days, so if we're calculating 4 nights, but that's 5 days of driving. but I did only calculate for petrol 1,000 rands a day. So per person, that's 2,000 rands. So I didn't count that 5th day. Okay, now to get into that private reserve or into the park, you pay conservation levies or entrance fees. So there's a difference again. The 220 per person per day makes 1,100 in the private reserve, 400 per person per day for 5 days, because you're 4 nights in the park, makes 2,000 rands per person for the national park. Your meals are all included at the lodge in the private reserve. In Kruger National Park, you'll have to do everything yourself. Now, I counted for that 1,600 rands per person for 4 days. That's 400 rands a day. You could say, I could do with less. Yeah, you can, but that's not the point. You're trying to compare with the experience you get from Shinzela, which is an evening dinner with 3 courses and all that. So you're trying to get a little bit of the same. So I did put in like 2 restaurant visits out of 4 days in the national park. I did include, a little bit of budget for desserts. Don't forget, since you're self-catering, you also have to buy your own charcoal and all that. So I do think that 400 rands per person per day is really not calculating too much. All right, the game drives or game walks are all included on the private reserve. In the national park, obviously, you're driving yourself. The thing is, though, every afternoon game drive on the private reserve ends with a bit of a night drive when they look for nocturnal animals with a spotlight. If you want to have that same experience in Kruger Park, you will have to book a night drive, because yourself you can't do that. You must be in the gate of your rest camp before the sun sets. So just to, again, balance things out, compare apples with apples, I did include the price of 1 night drive for these people doing self-driving Kruger National Park. The same goes for walks. I also included 1 walk, so that at least they have that experience as well. Okay, then this is a point that I actually already touched on a little bit before, but if you're self-driving, then in the park, then you do need a cooler box and cooling elements and a thermos and stuff like that. I added a little bit of an amount of money for that. Not too much, 500 rands per person. I don't think that is a lot. So that's just what I added for the Kruger National Park. Obviously, for the private reserve, you don't need any of that. It's all taken care of. The only thing so far that's not on my comparison now is drinks. If you're going to a private reserve, your drinks are to be paid when you check out. And which drinks do they charge you? They charge for anything that's alcohol. So if you buy a bottle of wine or a cocktail or anything like that, that'll be on your list. And they charge for sodas as well. Now, what they charge is normally, I'd say, very reasonable. If I compare to like what you would pay for a simple beer at our coastline somewhere in Europe, I think the prices in South Africa are about half. So it's not as if it's really a lot. Then again, obviously, if you do it all yourself, like self-driving in Kruger National Park, and you buy your bottles of alcohol or cans of Coke or whatever in the shop, you'll obviously pay much less. So the advantage here certainly goes to the Kruger National Park, you would think, but is that really the truth for an international visitor? Well, there's 2 remarks I must make here. First of all, some of the drinks are included in a private reserve's stay. All water that you drink, all fruit juice that they also put on the table during meals, all coffees and teas cost absolutely 0. Then again, if you want to drink just simple water or your coffee, etc., you have to buy all that as well in the Kruger National Park. So that's an extra cost right there. Moreover, if you're buying alcohol or cans of Coke or whatever, you'll most certainly buy a part of that in the shops of Kruger Restcamp. And there, the prices are not really the same as what you would pay outside the park. So if you really think about it, again, the price difference in what you would pay for drinks is not that much. The thing is, I've left it out of this comparison because it's really difficult to come to exact figures for this thing. But again, the difference is not that much. If we calculate now the total of both, then I come to 14,770 rands for a stay of 4 nights for 2 people on a private reserve. This is the amount of money per person. And in Kruger National Park, I come to a total of about 12,650 rands per person. So on a per day basis, that's 3,700 in the private reserve and 3,150 in the national park. That's a difference of somewhere between 500 and 550 rands per person per day. Converted to euros or dollars, 25 euros, $28 per person per day difference. Now remember what I said. My statement was that for a stay on a private reserve, I could get very close to the cost of a stay at Kruger National Park. I said not exact. I said very close. Now I'd argue that a difference of 25 euros per person per day is very close. And I also said you get more bang for the buck on a private reserve. So let's compare what you get as well. On a private reserve, you get that high standard of accommodation, but not just accommodation, it's also your guiding, it's also your food, and so on. Obviously, in the national park, the standard of accommodation is much lower. The standard of your food as well. We call it a restaurant in that Restcamp, but let's be honest, people, most of the options on there are fast food. Another thing is that on a private reserve, everything is done for you. You don't need to spend time doing dishes, cleaning up or whatever, even making your bed. They do everything for you. You're on vacation. In the Kruger National Park, obviously, you have to cook yourself, clean, and so on. So there's lots of things you must do yourself. So it's not the same thing. Okay, so sorry for the long explanation, but coming back to our previous comparison, now you know why price isn't mentioned anywhere in my comparison between the park and the private reserves. Not as a negative, not as a positive. So now we're looking at these negatives and positives of both, and now the question still remains. Which one do we choose now? Well, here's my answer, and for the first time in all these series, my answer is really gonna be with a meme, and I'm not even sorry. Seriously, people, why not both? Where does the notion even come from that if you choose one, you must dismiss the other entirely? Does the comparison that I'm showing you not prove that both have very distinctive positive arguments that the other one can't match? Doesn't that mean also that in order to get the ultimate safari experience in Kruger, a combination of both is ideal? I'd say that I've proven now that you should do both if you want to get the most out of your safari in Kruger National Park. So let's conclude this section with my third tip: combine the Kruger National Park and at least one private reserve. In my humble opinion, the ultimate is indeed a combo of both. And if you recall what I said earlier about your preferred length of stay in Kruger, well then it's clear. If you've got a short week to spend in Kruger area, certainly make sure that you do both. Because if you don't have that amount of time, you'll need to make some tough choices and you will not have appreciated nor experienced the Kruger to its fullest. And if you played smart, you can even avoid some of the negatives on this list. In particular, you can go to Kruger National Park without booking any of their low standard accommodation. Just book a room at a lodge outside the park borders. If you shop around for a bit, these lodges cost about the same as Kruger accommodation, but offer a much higher standard. Now again, I know there's some Kruger diehards out there that might say, but when you stay outside park borders, then you will lose valuable time in the morning, and the first hour of the day is the best for spotting wildlife. I make sure that I'm first at the exit gate of my rest camp every morning as to maximize my safari results. Well, I'm sorry again, dear Krugerholics, but I really must say that I don't entirely agree with that. To me, this getting out of the gate first thing is getting a little bit silly. The last time I spent a night in a rest camp, people started driving past my hut at 4 a.m. in the morning while it was still pitch dark to get in queue at the gate. And once there, lots of people seemed to leave their engines running. Probably they had the air conditioner on. You know, this was summertime and it was still rather hot, even early in the morning. It was very humid. So, but as you can imagine, it totally ruined the sleep of anyone looking to get up later. So I got up and I went to look at the queue of cars and I counted 37 cars. 37. This was at Satara. So just count the roads forking off from that rest camp. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in reality, the first 5 cars might have been the first on their road of choice. Only the first 5 cars at that gate that morning had the freshest wildlife, so to speak, in front of them. All the rest of the cars were stuck behind these 5 cars, eating their dust. Now, even if you count all the junctions further on the roads, you still get like 4 or 5 cars per road driving out in the morning. I honestly don't see the point. So I drive out a bit later, and I often have the road to myself entirely. And animals come back to those roads or close to those roads, and I have awesome sightings. And now that I'm stationed outside Kruger Open Gate, I still do the same. I get into that gate after the morning rush, and I often have the road completely to myself. So to me, this being able to start your game drive right after the gate opens, it kind of looks like, everybody laying their towels on a beach chair around the pool, in these big high-rise hotels around the Mediterranean coastline, as to have a good spot around the pool early morning. It's really silly. It is really not a reason to book accommodation in the park. It certainly does not outweigh the benefits of a lodge outside park borders. Benefits like the higher standard of accommodation, obviously, but also having more choices of restaurants and dishes when compared to that one restaurant you can go to in your rest camp. Or, if you cook for yourself, having multiple supermarkets which with way more choices and better prices than that one shop in your rest camp, those are also advantages. And one other big advantage, and certainly not the least one, if you book a lodge outside Kruger Park, you have the added bonus of being able to trade 1 or 2 days of safari time with other activities like visiting the panorama route. Let's go look again at that list of typical safari trips that I showed earlier. You may remember that this 8 days Kruger plus panorama route, that block was on the list a lot. Well, that was for 2 reasons. One, to avoid a safari that's so short that a cold front rolling through can ruin it. And two, because the panorama route is that one region you can easily add to bring some change of pace in your trip without having to deal with an increased travel or transit cost. So imagine this now. You got 8 days to spend in Kruger region, and you spend these as follows. First, you book a lodge outside the Greater Kruger Area, and from that lodge you spend 3 days in Kruger National Park, either going on guided tours or in self-drive mode, that's up to you. You stay in the same lodge, no need to move. For a change of pace the next 2 days, you visit the panorama route, 1 day, and 2 lovely attractions like Jessica the Hippo, Moholo Holo Animal Rehab Center, and so on the next day. Again, you have the option self-drive or have a guide take you there. You can see a clear change of pace, in the middle of your Kruger trip now. And then, after those 5 days in one lodge, you hand in your rental car at the airport, and your transfer company picks you up there and takes you to your lodge on a private reserve. Or if you had no car for the first 5 days and you did everything with organized trips, well, then your transfer company picks you up at the one lodge and drops you off at that other lodge in a private reserve. And so the last 3 days of your trip, you're staying on that private reserve for, very intimate and action-packed game drives. Now, these type of schedules for 8 days in the park, 8 days in Kruger, that is, there's no better way to fill in that 1 week spent in Kruger area. You literally cannot have a more fun-packed and action-packed vacation here in Kruger Lowveld. Okay, so now that we've established that, a combination of Kruger National Park and at least one private reserve would be ideal, and now that you know if you have a short week to stay in Kruger, what a typical itinerary would be, ideally, to combine both, I guess your next question might be, well, what lodges do I choose then? Which ones are the best ones? Well, for the lodges outside Kruger National Park, that answer is really easy for me. Obviously, the best lodge is our own lodge. Nah, okay. I'm joking. I honestly cannot say that. So I won't. Seriously, there's a reason why I posted these videos under the name of our travel agency and not in the name of our lodge. Because the truth is that your choice of lodge really depends on a lot of factors, and only if you can tell me what you are looking for will I be able to answer that question. So let me show you what I mean. Our own lodge is located, let me zoom in, is located right here. This is our farm. That's smack in the middle of Orpen Gate, which is here, and Kruger Park Gate here, and then the Abel Erasmus Pass and the Strijdom Tunnel, which is the beginning of the panorama route, which is here. As such, we are closer to both than a lot of lodges around Hoedspruit town, for example. I mean, certainly when it comes to Orpen, to Kruger National Park. Plus, we have the added bonus of being right underneath the escarpment, so we can offer an amazing view to all our guests. Now, we offer self-catering cottages, so pretty much the same formula as the cottages in Kruger National Park, but of a much higher standard. Our kitchens are better equipped, our king-size beds are under a big mozzie net, and they are of better quality mattresses and linen and all that. Our cottages are much bigger, our barbecue equipment is much better, every unit has a private plunge pool and an outdoor shower, and all units also offer 100% privacy, so there's no one from another unit that can see you. We are more expensive than similar accommodation in Kruger National Park if you go by our rack rates, but if you grab our Pay 3 Stay 4 special, then prices are almost the same. Now, okay, I'm just describing our lodge, but before you accuse me and go, you're like, hold on, now he is promoting his lodge. Well, yeah, kinda, a bit, but the point I'm trying to make is, this is who we are, and we have a lot of things going for us, but we are just one lodge of so many lodges in the neighborhood. So, if we would have all the aces in our hands, we'd be the only lodge doing good business, while the other lodges struggled a lot or are copying us as fast as they can. And obviously, that is not the case. Unfortunately for my wife and I'd say. There's many more lodge choices, each with different but perhaps other major selling points, parameters that appeal to tourists that are not booking with us. So, people looking for privacy may choose us. If you're thinking of, well, I'm on a honeymoon and I want, I want a bit of privacy with my accommodation, then our lodge would be a logical choice. And people who are into self-catering might also consider us. Well, we offer meals, restaurants deliver to your door, but that's not the point. People who are self-drive may also choose us. However, people who are more into Kruger and for whom the panorama route is less important, will probably choose a lodge closer to the park entrance than ours. People who like eating out may choose a lodge closer to all the restaurants in Hoedspruit town. Um, People who come in big groups or families, with 8 or 6 people traveling together, will perhaps rather rent a self-catering house somewhere in the estates around Hoedspruit. Their per person cost will be an amount that we can't match no matter what reduction we give them. Some people may have a lower budget and may be looking for something cheaper, like a lodge that offers the same standard accommodation as Kruger Restcamps, but at a lower rate. They won't go with us, they will book somewhere else. And yet again, there might be other people that have a higher budget and that go for a lodge that's much more posh than ours. So, what I'm trying to say is every lodge has these distinctive positives as well as negatives again, and based on what you tell me, what your priorities are, only when I know all that could I point out the lodge that's best for you. There's almost as many lodges as there are types of customers. And right now, I don't know you. I don't know what you're looking for. I don't know what animals you want to see most as well. So if we're talking about lodges on the private reserves, that's another parameter that I need to know. Again, another thing, I don't know what type of accommodation you prefer, a tent or a cottage, etc. And it's not even just about you. There's other parameters. For example, the season you are looking to come. Based on that, my choices might be different. I sometimes base my choices and my recommendations on current information on the amount of rain some areas have had and on the distribution of key species, or on the distribution of or the presence of one species even. For example, if you're looking to see wild dogs and by coincidence I know the property where a pack is denning right now and you can get here quickly and the lodge nearby has availability, then I'll send you there. Obviously, the further you book in advance, the more difficult it is to anticipate where some species will thrive best, but you get the idea. Anyway, this leads me to tip number 4. Please do not believe anyone who says Lodge X is perfect for you after having spoken to you for only 5 minutes or so, or even before getting to know you at all. The bottom line for me is you must forgive me for not pointing you towards the so-called best lodge for you at this point, because I can't. What I can point out though is the areas I often send people to. So for that, let me use the map again. For a lodge outside Kruger Park borders, a lodge that can also serve as a base to explore the panorama route, I tend to stay away from busy places like Hazy View, like here. I know there's lots of lodges there, but I tend to stay away from them because it's rather busy in that area. Actually, I tend to avoid the south of the park entirely because it's a very busy area and there's lots of entrance gates and lots of daytime tourists coming in and so many lodges with so many open vehicles as well. It's not my favorite area of Kruger Park. So typically, for a lodge outside Kruger National Park that has to serve as a base to visit Kruger National Park, I would choose a lodge that's on the low veld here, underneath the escarpment, close to Campus Rustown, which is here, and then Hoedspruit town, and even Falaborwa town. So your entrance gate to Kruger would be Orpen Gate, which is right here, or Falaborwa Gate, which is right here. That is typically where I would choose a lodge outside the Kruger National Park. It's not only about Kruger National Park, obviously. It's also because this section offers the added bonus, and I spoke about this in video number 4, of being able to visit the Bladder Canyon, Mohola Hola Rehab Center, which is here, Jessica the Hippo, Kinyonga Snake Park, and so many other little attractions, things that are typically not available or further away when you book elsewhere around the park. And last but not least, because the entrance to the panorama route is really close. So if you're looking for a more quiet spot from where to do the panorama route as well, and certainly the most, I'd say, popular part of the panorama route, which is this road here, the R532, then the Lowveld here is your best choice. There's only one other entrance towards that nicest bit of the panorama route from underneath the mountain, and that's from this side. But as I said, Hazy View and all that, and Bushbuck Ridge, that's much more populated and by far not as quiet as the Lowveld part here. For your lodge inside the private reserves, as I said, it depends on a lot of factors, but if your travel cost is really important, then I tend to propose a lodge in Klasiri, Balule or Timbavati reserves. So this is Timbavati, this is Klasiri, this is Balule. Why do I choose those 3 reserves? Well, I mentioned this before as well, but they are all close to Hoedspruit Airport, which is right here, Hoedspruit Eastgate Airport. So if people have to transfer you from that airport to a lodge on a private reserve or to a lodge outside the reserve, but on that Lowveld section of my choice, remember I said for lodge outside the park, I would also choose this section. Or for a transfer even between the lodge outside the park and the lodge inside one of the private reserves. All these transfers, the cost of those will be very bearable. Now, I know I elaborated on this at the end of the video in which I discuss all the private reserves, but let me just repeat it. You have to see it from the standpoint of a transfer company. Those transfer companies come from busy places here like Hazy View, Bushbuck Ridge and all that. They are located in Hoedspruit as well. Some are in Campus Rust, which is that little town right here. As you know, all transfers happen over noon. The flights land over noon, depart over noon. You check out over noon at one lodge and you check in your other lodge over noon and so on. So a transfer company can only do one such transfer per day. He has to make a living off of that. And what does a transfer company has to do? He has to drive to your place where you are. Let's say he comes from this road and he comes and fetches people from our lodge. So he's been driving for a bit already, and then with you on board, he will drive to a private reserve. So let's say that's Kasiri, so he drives this way, and then he goes into Kasiri Reserve this way, all the way to a certain lodge here. That'll take him, I'd say, an hour, maybe even more. And then he drops you off, and then he still has to come out all the way and go back home. There is no way he can add a second customer on his list that same day, or he should be very lucky. So transfer costs per person, imagine you're just a couple and this guy is driving you for quite a bit. So even if you're on board with him like for an hour and a half in total, he's been driving for 5 hours or so, you're gonna pay for the 5 hours and the gas and the this and the that. And plus, even if that is not a full working day for him, he has to make a living off of that. So too bad, but he will charge a price that he can live off. Otherwise, there's no point in him in doing this work. So your cost of that particular transfer will be a certain extensive amount. It's not like it's a taxi fare in any major city in Europe, but you know where I'm going with this. It is not one of the cheapest things, transfers. If you can split transfers over more people, obviously it gets to be cheaper. Now imagine that instead of one of these three reserves, I would have chosen another reserve, like Sabi Sand. That would mean he would have to drive maybe a short distance to pick you up, but then he would have to drive a long way to get you to the right lodge on Sabi Sand. And not only that, but if you chose, round tickets for our local airline here, you'd have to depart from Hoedspruit again as well. So that means another expensive transfer for him, driving a long way to come and fetch you and a long way to drop you off at Hoedspruit, and then a shorter way for him to get back home. But you can see, if your private reserve is far from your local airport of choice, then you're going to pay quite the price. So this is why typically, if budget is important, that these three reserves are my three most popular go-to places when it comes to choosing a lodge on a private reserve. Now, don't get me wrong, I do send people to the other reserves as well. If you have booked a stay in Mozambique, for example, then you'll be flying out from this airport anyway. So then it really serves no purpose for me to choose these three reserves in particular, because you're going to have to do that far transfer anyway, right? To get to this airport and to fly to Mozambique. So then, obviously, there's an amount of transfer costs that you cannot avoid. So then I might choose a reserve like Magnoleti and Sabi Sand. If you stay longer than 8 days, I might also propose 2 lodges in private reserves. Let's not forget, so far I've been talking about a typical safari length of 8 days, but customers stay as long as they want. So if they stay just 1 day longer, I might perhaps not add any lodge, but just advise them to, take it a bit slower. Perhaps they could do with an extra day somewhere in the middle of their safari just to unwind, stay at the lodge, enjoy the pool with a good glass of wine, and don't add extra activities on that day. But if you add more and more and more days, and let's say you get to 10, 11, 12 days, typically I would propose to stay longer on the private reserves and to split your safari days over 2 lodges on 2 different private reserves. Again, this is to optimize your chances to see as many key species as possible, and also to optimize the amounts of time you get to see them, because it's just not about seeing them once, it's about seeing them preferably multiple times. And it's also about offering you a different landscape and even a different vegetation type or habitat. It's just to keep it fresh for you. So then I would combine a lodge on Balule, for example, with a lodge on Timbavati. Perfectly doable. Okay, so unfortunately I can't give you specific tips with regards to what lodge to book. I can only do so if I get to know you and know what your wishes and needs are. Which leads me to tip number 5. There's plenty of holidays you can book without the help of a travel agent. But a safari is not a typical holiday. So seek a travel agent that you can trust and that has a lot of knowledge to share about the safari region of your choice. Could be me, could be anyone else. I'm just at this point giving you this information so that you don't make the mistake of booking with a travel agent that is far away from this region and doesn't know anything about it, or that you start assembling your own safari trip, basically like throwing darts at a darts board, hoping to land in places that are doing the things right and hoping to score a good safari, but with a big uncertainty that it will be a good safari. Do not make this mistake, please. When it comes to your choice of travel agent, preferably that means, in this case, a travel agent based in Kruger area, because he or she is more likely to have the latest status on all reserves and all lodges and knows where the best deals are. Another reason is also that overseas travel agents, they tend to have a higher wage cost than the travel agents locally here in South Africa. So they tend to charge more than the rack rates that lodges have on their websites. While agents based in South Africa, that's not the case. A third reason is that a local travel agent here has typically volume deals with transfer companies. So again, avoiding those transfer costs, they will be slightly lower if you deal with a travel agent from here in the area. And last but not least, travel agents will know about specials here, and that can save you a lot of money. You may think, money-wise, I'm best off to book my lodges via an online travel agent that has a huge volume, because those are the ones that take the lowest commissions, sites like booking.com. The truth is that for most hotels that might be true, but it's the safari lodges here in the area who decide what the price, including commission, is on such sites. So for our lodges, the situation is different. Typically, our lodges will match that price with their rack rate. So you might find a rack rate of 1,000 rands or whatever on their page, and it will be the same amount on booking.com, but then booking.com would get 10% of that or something like that. But it would still be the same price. So you cannot get a better deal by booking via booking.com. Now I'm gave you an example of the regular prices, but when it comes to promotions, then for local lodges, it's a lot of trouble and work pushing those promotions onto all those sites like booking.com and Expedia and TripAdvisor, etc. So they often don't. They put specials on their websites. They give specials to local travel agencies, typical safari specialists that work a lot with them. But you will not see those special tariffs on any big online travel agency. Now the question is not only where do I book, but also when do I book? And in this case, my answer is simple. So let me just call that tip number 6. Please book as far in advance as possible. The best lodges fill up the quickest by travel agents as well as their returning customers. There may be some exceptions, typically lodges that aren't that known yet, but in the most busy seasons, those lodges will fill up very quickly as well. And it's not just about lodges, it's about local flights too. There's a limited amount of flights to Kruger area, and an even smaller amount of the cheapest economy seats on those flights. And by the way, there's no purpose in booking a more expensive seats on these flights because flight times are short and all seats are pretty much the same. So if you want to get those cheap seats, and if you want to get space at the most preferred lodges, please book as far in advance as possible. Then another question you might have, you might wonder, what season do I go? The truth is there's no real bad season in Kruger. In our summertime, it can get very hot over noon. And it is our rainy season, so you may get some rain if you are unlucky. Then again, it never rains for long, certainly not for days on end, like in Northern Europe, for example. Besides, local thunderstorms are awesome to experience and photograph. But that little bit of rain might be a downside. Another downside is that there's a very small malaria risk in this season. Now, on the positive side, this is the greenest season, so your images will not have any dull backgrounds. Lots of grazers have their babies in this season, and there's much more birds as well. All our summer migrants are here. Also, our plunge pools are most enjoyable in the summertime. Let's compare that to wintertime. In wintertime, it gets very cold at night and early morning. Not freezing temperatures, but it can get very close sometimes. This means you'll need to work in layers because by 10 in the morning it will start to heat up again. So you'll have to pack way more clothing items in our winter time. And even if you start early morning with a beanie and gloves and a scarf and a fleece and all that, by noon you'll be walking around in t-shirt and shorts again. Now, the bush is also very dry in this season, so it's a bit easier to spot animals perhaps, but when you photograph them, your backgrounds will be rather dull. Some, if not most days, it may also be too cold to really enjoy any pool. It may be hot at noon, but the water will be really cold. Then again, you won't suffer from the heat, and you'll most likely have no rain, as this is our dry season. And there's also no malaria in this season. A negative again is certainly that there's less birds in this season. All our summer migrants are gone. And for the enthusiast, much less insect life as well. Come to think of it, if you don't like creepy crawlies, that might be an additional reason not to come in our summertime. So that's summer and winter. So perhaps spring or fall are more to your liking, but they also have their positives and negatives. I'd say in our fall, everything is still very green up to, say, the end of May. And in our spring, everything is at its driest and it can get a little bit dusty. That is until the first rain falls, of course, and just before that period, it'll get very humid again. Like the air will be very hot and humid, but it will still be very dry on the ground. So it's a very, very strange couple of weeks that do not appeal to everyone. Now, for the most part, though, in these seasons, you do avoid the weather extremities. And you even avoid our busiest periods because let's not forget, in our winter months, July and August, lots of people from the Northern Hemisphere are here as it's their summer holiday. And around Christmas, they also have a holiday. But then around Christmas, the South African nationals have their holidays as well. So from, say, half of December to half of January. So if you want to avoid those crowds, then you can do so by coming in the fall or in spring. Now, you'll have to avoid Easter as well and the half-term school holidays somewhere in October. So I can actually conclude with this: choose the right season for you. Choose a season that suits you most. Another question again. People also ask, what accommodation should I choose? How about a tent? Do I need to rather book cottages with stone walls? Or from the start, when I meet them, they don't ask the question, but they tell me straight up, like, what their preferred type of accommodation is. They will tell me things like, I would like a cottage with stone walls because I don't want any insects in my room, or something like that. So let me maybe elaborate on that a little bit, because it does have a link with my previous tip about the seasons. You see, in the hottest days of summer, it can get very hot in a tent, and in the coldest days of winter, it can get rather cold in a tent. But I'd say it's nothing that can't be fixed. Over noon in the summer, switch on the fan. During that cold winter night, plenty of soft blankets and a water bottle at your feet. Quite romantic. Seriously, the seasons shouldn't decide your accommodation type. I'd argue that actually windy nights are the most annoying in a tent. The canvas flapping may keep you up or wake you up, but you can get windy nights in any season. You also shouldn't choose an accommodation type because you deem it less safe. No dangerous predators have ever gone into a tent that's closed, and no elephant has ever trampled a big tent. I mean, we're talking big tents here, not small tents like backpackers and campers sometimes use. Lodges that offer tented accommodation call it glamping, not camping, and right they are. These things are as huge as a regular hotel room. Tents are also not more prone to get insects, scorpions, spiders, snakes, whatever. You might think that, but it's as easy to close a tent as it is to close a regular hut. I'd argue that accommodation with thatched roof, so the typical stone huts with thatched roofs, actually get more bugs because there's lots of stuff living in that thatched roof. So, what should you use and what should you base your choice on? In all honesty, it's really what you prefer or feel most comfortable with. But to that, I should add, maybe you should get out of your comfort zone a little bit here. Like, for example, personally, I prefer tents when it comes to lodges on Big 5. Because during most days, you can sleep with the tent flaps open, while under a muzzinet, obviously. This makes it easy to keep your tent cool at night, so no noisy air conditioner is needed, which means you can enjoy the nightly sounds of the bush, and there is nothing as thrilling as hearing lions roar in the distance. By contrast, accommodation with stone walls, that's more difficult to keep cool at night, so you will need an aircon lots of times, and that air conditioner, as well as the thick walls, keep all the bush noises out, so you miss part of the fun. So really it's up to you, but if you are not really the type of person that's super afraid of anything and dares to step out of your comfort zone for a little bit, then my advice would be don't dismiss tented accommodation. For me, the bottom line is, and let me call this tip number 8 then, choose an accommodation that you like, but don't dismiss a camp for its accommodation if your travel agent says it's the best choice. Next up, clothing. I can be really short on this one. I know lots of sites and travel agents and books, etc., advise you to invest in an entire safari garderobe with neutral colors and so on. To be honest, most animals don't see the spectrum of colors as we do. Plus, they're so used to seeing us all the time in our cars that they don't give a damn even if you're wearing a Pink Panther outfit in the purest pink. Blue jeans is no problem either. The tsetse flies that are drawn to that color have long been eradicated. The only two important things when it comes to clothing is first, choose clothing that absorbs sweat easily and that dries easily. So if you want to do a quick wash and you can dry it, perfect. If you plan to go on walks, and this is the other important thing, if you plan to go on walks, then you can't wear pure white or any other very bright clothing, as then the animals will spot you from really far away, which is exactly what you're trying to avoid. So in that case, you will need some neutral colored clothing. But other than that, any clothing is fine. So tip number 9, save yourself a lot of money and don't invest in a new garderobe specifically for a safari. Okay, so what have I forgot so far? Ah yes, if you opt for a lodge outside Kruger National Park, the question I get most often is, should I drive myself? Should I self-drive in Kruger or not? That's a good question as well. It really depends. If you are on a tight budget, then I'd say self-driving will certainly be the cheapest option. Employing a guide will cost a bit more, obviously. Then again, self-driving does require a bit of confidence. It all comes down to how good you can keep your cool in elephant sightings, because that's basically the only animal that might damage your car. Your entry permit will be very clear in that regard. It rightly assumes most people cannot interpret elephant behavior and therefore advises to keep a fair distance from all elephants. That's easier said than done though. I've seen accidents happen because people keep their engine running as to be able to get away from elephants fast, but what they don't know is that the running engine is often interpreted by an elephant as a sign of aggression. So every time they rev their engine to get some more distance between them and the elephant, they actually make it worse and the elephant gets more annoyed. Typically, the elephant just flaps its ears as to tell them that they need to go, but then relaxes and gives them time to go, but that ear flap can be so intimidating that people try to get away from that elephant in a hurry, and they back out of the sighting without looking in their mirror and smash into another car. I've seen it happen not once, but multiple times. Now, the way I treat elephant sightings, if it's bulls, which can be seen in profile by the rounder head, a cow has a flatter head, and which you can also see by that little pouch between their hind legs, which contains their penis, but it's mostly retracted. So if it's bulls, then I check if none of them is in must, and that you can see by looking behind their back legs. If it's wet and in between their back legs, if it's wet, that's because in must their penis is constantly dripping urine. An elephant in must has a high testosterone level, so I don't stick around, or I certainly will not get close to a bull elephant like that. But if it's just a regular bull, or more than one bull, or a breeding herd, what I typically do is I check the way they are going and wait for them there. It may look weird to other cars around me, as it may look like I'm driving away from the sighting, but elephants follow game trails. These are narrow pathways through the bush, and those pathways will cross the road eventually. So I wait for them there. And I position my vehicle so that I get the best view without blocking the game trail, of course, and then I switch my engine off. Now, elephants are slow thinkers, but typically when they see me standing there, they stand still on that game trail and they take a moment to check if I'm a danger to them. And then they just continue on their way because they see that I'm not a danger. And they pass me at a very short distance. It's an amazing experience, and it's only spoiled by the occasional other vehicle that wants to get as close as I do. But then typically with a roaring engine, so you can imagine how that goes and how that works out for them. Lots of drivers give me this look like they don't understand why I never get any signs of aggression while they get plenty. So it's rather funny for me. Anyway, I'm not telling you this so you can go self-driving and do the same, because it's a bit more complicated than that. For example, I haven't touched on young elephant bulls that have just been expelled from the herd but still stick around. They require, let's say, a special treatment of approach as well. But I'm telling you this as an example of why going on guided trips may have some advantages for you, certainly if you've never driven in a big 5 area before. Indeed, your guide will interpret animal behavior better, and as a result, you may get a better safari experience with some very close encounters. And his or her eyes are also more accustomed to the bush than yours, so he or she will probably spot more animals than you. And guides share sightings in various ways. The park doesn't really like it, but you can't stop progress of technology, I guess, so it happens. So if you do a guided tour, typically you will also see more cat sightings. So my tip, and that's tip number 10, would be go on guided drives if you have no experience. Do self-drives once you have some experience. But that doesn't cover all of it, because an additional question is which one is better for the park? An open vehicle or a closed vehicle? Now, my personal take on that is that for a drive that starts from a lodge outside the park, a closed vehicle is actually better. But it must be an SUV type of car, or at least something that's a bit higher on its wheels, so that the gravel roads don't pose much of a problem. The only exception, you may go for an open vehicle if you are with a big group, say like 4 or more people, and the vehicle is only used by that group and no one else. So why is that my opinion? Well, an open vehicle has some disadvantages if you depart from a lodge outside the park. First, you have to drive to the entrance gate, and you want to get there as fast as possible. But if you drive too fast, it gets really cold for the people sitting in the back of the vehicle, because the canvas offers little protection from the wind. Then, over noon in all but our winter time, it gets really hot in an open car. There's no way to close windows or to put on an air conditioning, so it might just feel like you're starting to melt. And that feeling typically only goes away when the temperatures start to drop again in the afternoon, but by then it's almost sundown. And lastly, if you share your vehicle with people that you don't know, they might have other interests, or they may want to go different places than you in the park, or they may want to get out of the park sooner than you, or later, etc. The only advantage that an open vehicle has, which is that it's easier to take pictures from, is also only true when the people on the vehicle are all known to you, because at least then you can make good agreements on who sits where and who takes what photograph and so on. So my take is that you should get an open vehicle if it's for your family or friends only, and if you can deal with the bit of a cold drive to the park in the morning and with the heat in the afternoon. Note that a private open vehicle comes at an extra cost when compared to the per person cost of a regular guided vehicle. However, if you can split that cost over 6 or so people, then it's really not a big deal. So tip 11, big group, go to Kruger National Park in a private open vehicle. Small group, choose a private trip as well, but in an SUV. I would never ever share my vehicle with people that I don't know. Doesn't seem like the right thing to do for Kruger National Park itself. All right, what else? Oh yes, let me throw tip 12 at you straight away. Learn to use your camera gear before you come on safari. Please. I've seen so many people that struggle with their camera gear. I can't count the amount of times that I've seen people get seriously frustrated with some serious expensive camera gear that they don't know how to use. And they blame the salesperson that sold it to them, or they blame the brand. I should have got the other brand, They blame everything and everyone except themselves. Get real, people. If you don't know how to handle your camera, that's your own fault. And we can help you a little bit, maybe even give you a few quick lessons, but that will not help you in all situations. And us guides, we're not around all the time. And it's a shame if you don't get to go home with optimal photo results. I'll just give you an anecdote. I once had this person on my vehicle with the most expensive Canon body and the camera grip underneath, so the battery grip underneath, and the most expensive camera lens that you can buy from Canon, like an L series, the one with the tele lens with the converter built in. Forgot what the range is now. And he bought it the day before, can you imagine, the day before he departed on holiday. And here I am in the front, and I've got camera gear as well, and it's Canon as well by coincidence. So we're in this leopard sighting, and that leopard is sitting in a tree. This is after dark, we've got the spotlight on. And I decide to grab some shots as well. So I open my camera bag and, put it in the right settings. And my camera gear is old. I mean, I do have quite decent lenses, but my camera bodies are absolutely old. So I can't even go like into a high ISO mode like he could or whatever. And I don't have like a buffer that can take 20 shots in 1 second or something like that. But still, my camera goes like click, 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 click when I press that shutter button. And I know that in that series of 7 shots that I took, there's gonna be a sharp picture of that leopard because I've set it to the right settings to do so. And he's sitting straight behind me, and I can hear his camera going click, clack, click, clack. Shutter speeds of like a second or more. Obviously, handheld. So with the camera in his hand. So obviously, that all those pictures came out blurry, and he could see that on his display at the back of his camera. And I can hear him like mumbling and to his wife, and he was about to throw his camera gear overboard, I think. And so I turned around and said, give me your camera. And I've put it the way it should be, high ISO but not too high, and a small aperture, so that he gets the maximum shutter speed. I underexposed, I think, for a stop or so as well, as to counter the very strong spotlight on the leopard. And I gave the camera back to him and I said, here, try again. So he pressed that shutter, he aimed at the leopard and he pressed that shutter button, and his machine went like like a book of cards. And obviously all those pictures came out awesome, and he was like, oh my god, honey, look at this. I'm gonna keep it in these settings forever. So I just smacked my head. I'm like, no, 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 no. You can't have the same settings during the daytime as you have during the nighttime. So I'm basically trying to say, if please don't be one of those people. Please, it's not that difficult shooting wildlife on safari. There's a very simple couple of tricks, and then you can basically keep it in the same mode for 95% of the time. If anyone's interested, let me know and I'll make a quick special video or whatever on it and post it as well, so that people know what to do. But yeah, please try to get on top of your camera gear before you come out to the bush and start shooting wildlife with it. Alright, I'll end this video on this funny but slightly painful story. Stay tuned for part 6 of this series, where I cover some typical more question and answers.